Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for another installment of Starter Pack, where I give you guys a series of albums that I think would make a good introduction to a particular genre that you might not be all that familiar with. And in this episode, we're going to be talking sludge metal. Sludge metal, sludge metal, sludge metal. What the hell's up with sludge metal? Sludge metal is a metal offshoot that has roots in doom metal and in hardcore punk music. Some roots in thrash metal, I would say, as well, where you take some of the slower, moodier, spacier sounds of a Pentagram, of a Black Sabbath, of a St. Vitus, or something like that, and then you just kind of harden those sounds up, make them more distorted, more aggressive, add in some speedier passages, add in some more aggressive vocal styles, some more screams, some more guttural growls, and then you're pretty much getting close to the sludge metal recipe. Now, of course, once you have that bass line, you can go in a myriad of different directions, which all the bands that we list in this starter pack do. So let's go over them. A lot of these bands were forged in the 90s, which is kind of where much of this genre has its sturdiest roots. Maybe not its earliest, but certainly its sturdiest and most culturally significant roots or parts of its musical genealogy. Let's kick it off with the Acid Bath album, When the Kite String Pops. This album cover, man. This friggin' album cover. Acid Bath is a band that is fronted by one Mr. Dax Riggs, and this is a brand of sludge metal that is very animalistic. It is very noisy, very aggressive and distorted. Of course, you have a track here and there that are a bit more moody and melodic in tone, as many sludge metal bands have over the years. You know, quite a few dynamic sludge metal bands out there wanted to sort of show their hand at balladry and melody. You know, sludge metal isn't just this totally aggressive meat and potatoes slugfest a lot of the time. In fact, a lot of sludge metal bands, some of them who have started in the 90s, have kind of mellowed out over the years and are kind of making more atmospheric sludge metal albums, which is a style of sludge metal we'll get into a little bit later in this thing. But Acid Bath's brand of sludge metal was pretty aggressive, was pretty nasty, pretty gross. And a lot of the lyrics on this thing, if, it's not surprising given the cover here. But a lot of the lyrics on this thing, pretty freaking edgy, pretty edgy. Maybe too edgy for me sometimes, but hey, there's a lot of great edgy metal bands out there. So, you have your heavy riffs here. The song structures aren't too crazy or anything like that. The tracks are patient, though. It's not like these songs are just kind of straightforward and super hooky or anything like that. It's about the heaviness. It's about the noisiness. It's about the riffs and just, again, those animalistic vocals. And recording on this thing, a little brittle, heavy but brittle, very dense, very saturated. Definitely a landmark album for the style. One of the more underground records, though. It's kind of like an underground hit. You know what I mean? Like Acid Bath never quite got the attention or the widespread respect that a Mastodon has received, for example. But for people who truly know and love their sludge metal, Acid Bath is a must. Moving on from there, Down, who, if you give this band a listen, you may already be familiar with the vocals, or they may feel very familiar with you because the singer of Down is Phil Anselmo of Pantera fame. And if you get into this record, you're going to feel a lot of those same kind of groove metal vibes that you might get off of a Pantera album, but a little bit slower, a little bit heavier, a little bit more patient on this album. It's still an aggressive experience. It's still very angry, and there are certainly more references to stoner culture on this thing and drug use. Like the drugginess of this album is so much more in your face. In some ways, this is kind of like a raw and less, less commercially viable Pantera in a lot of ways. And that's not to sell the band short or anything like that. I'm just trying to give you an expectation as to what you're going to hear when you go into this thing. Certainly not my favorite thing to come out of, Phil's canon, but, it's definitely a highlight for the sludge metal genre. And again, speaks to the versatility of the style too, because there are quite a few songs on here that do have kind of 90s alternative rock and alternative metal influences seeping in a little bit, so it's interesting to hear those sounds kind of mix in with the heavier, more aggressive sludge metal style on this thing. Moving on from there, High on Fire, Death is this communion. Excuse me, dealing with a little bit of a cough here. This is one of my favorite High on Fire records, one of my favorite sludge metal records too. High on Fire is a pretty fantastic sludge metal band, very no frills, very no bullshit, very great musicianship, very strong playing, very great sense of groove and intensity in their songs. This, in my opinion, is one of their best produced records as well. One of their most dynamic too, because you do have some more mellow moments on this album that go over really well and bring in some interesting and surprising bits of instrumentation that you wouldn't necessarily suspect given the first few tracks of this thing and just how brutal they are. This record for sludge metal seems, in my opinion, to carry like a little bit of a hard rock and heavy metal influence a little bit. I would say specifically like a Motorhead influence, which I think has melted away like a wee bit as the band has progressed further and further into their discography, especially on their new records. Of course, High on Fire is fronted by Matt Pike of Sleep fame, who, if you don't know Sleep, definitely listen to Sleep, but they're, more of the stoner and kind of doom side of things, not quite the sludge metal sound that High on Fire brings to the table. Very aggressive, very straightforward, and again, that Motorhead influence is super apparent in the riffs, in the grooves, the driving grooves on this album, and certainly Matt Pike's vocal style, which I think has kind of come into its own much more as the years have drawn on. But on this record, like, the Lemmy influence is clear as fucking day. But that doesn't necessarily take away from the quality of the album, though. Great riffs, great playing, great performances, good, heavy, clear production for the time period, and very well put together record. Next, Isis, Panopticon. Isis is an atmospheric sludge metal band. Okay, considered to be an atmospheric sludge metal band. A lot of people call bands in this style post-metal and sort of liken them to a lot of the third wave post-rock bands of the era, and it's not hard to see why. Certainly, I feel like post-rock bands of this era and metal bands in this particular style did have a bit of a crossover of influence. And on top of that, I feel like they were using like a lot of the same reverby, splashy, twangy guitar tones to sort of enhance the atmosphere of their songs as well. So there is that similarity too. Isis, in my opinion, is probably the best band in the whole atmospheric sludge metal sound, at least this leg of it in the 2000s. Now, that's not to say, I think the band is perfect. I actually find Isis's approach on pretty much all their albums to be a little bit measured for my taste. Like, this is not a very animalistic listen. This is not a very aggressive and visceral listen. Like, Isis's approach to things is very slow. It's very contemplative. Even when you do have some growled or aggressive vocals in the background, even when you do have some immense shifts in volume sort of blasting at you out of nowhere, even when these hard-hitting moments do happen, the overall sound of Isis's music is very kind of meditative, you know what I mean? Which has always just kind of left me a little cold on their music, though I will say, I will agree, Panopticon has to be their best effort. So if you are looking to dip your toes into the whole atmospheric sludge metal side of things, I would definitely recommend trying out Isis's Panopticon. There's certainly an epicness to it, a glacial epicness to it that I do admire, and hopefully I've done this album justice and maybe gotten some of you guys interested in it. It's not quite as rough and dirty as like an acid bath, nowhere near as rough and dirty. Like, there's a pristineness to it, there's a cleanliness to it that sort of sets it apart from its contemporaries. That's quite nice. It's just not necessarily what drives me and what makes me excited to listen to a metal record. Next, Mastodon, who you guys are probably all pretty familiar with at this point. If you're not, Mastodon is a sludge metal group that brings in elements of, hard rock and I would say even progressive metal into their sounds. The song structures on their records are pretty ambitious. With this record as well, you also get kind of a bit of a concept going because the lyrics and much of the material on this album are inspired by Moby Dick, of all things, which is pretty interesting. Not my favorite Mastodon album, but probably as popular as it is and truly a fan favorite for a lot of good reasons, because of the concept, because of just how fantastic and flashy a lot of the riffs are. I don't really have too much to say about it because I feel like I'm going to say whatever other people have said about this album, and most likely you guys are familiar with Mastodon already. Mastodon is no secret in the world of music, much less sludge metal, but I definitely wanted to leave this in there because just in case somebody doesn't know what the hell Mastodon is or know what sludge metal is at all, I would probably recommend starting with either this album or this album first, because these are probably two of the easier listens in this bunch. If not one of these two records, then I would definitely recommend that you guys listen to this record first if you are trying to dip your toes into sludge metal. This is the Melvins album Houdini. They are a West Coast sludge metal act who infamously put out this record on Atlantic Records at the recommendation of Kurt Cobain, who was super huge in the music industry at the time after, Nirvana blew up with Nevermind and all that. And he was just basically like, hey, I want to get all these bands signed. I want to get these artists signed who I think are fantastic, I think are amazing, I think deserve some attention. Let's get Melvins on a major label. And goddamn, they made one of the best sludge metal albums of all time. This is a fantastic record. This to me embodies everything that sludge metal is all about, and it executes it so well. In such a way that I don't think they or any band would have been able to had they not had the major label backing that they did on this record. The recording on this thing is incredible. The riffs are super heavy. They're monstrous. They're animalistic. At times, Buzz, the lead singer of the band, on this album, which doesn't happen often in Melvin's music, it's kind of something specific to this record. Occasionally he comes off like a warped mutant James Hetfield of Metallica on some of these tracks, especially when the riffs get a little thrashier in tone. This is a pretty dynamic album too. There's a lot of different vibes on this record. There are tracks that take on more of a punk tone, then more of a metal tone. There are tracks that find, somewhere in the middle. And there are a lot of cuts on this thing. If you pick this record up, especially if you get, I believe there have been re-released versions with extra tracks and shit like that, because this is a very celebrated album. If you get something like that, you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck. This is a fantastic, heavy, amazing, very fun album to listen to. And that's another thing. Melvins have always had kind of a bit of a, if you can't already tell from the cover, a bit of a kookier side to their style. So there is something a little weird. There is something a little tongue-in-cheek. There is something a little freaky about their approach to things, which I definitely appreciate quite a bit. So Melvins, Houdini, highly recommended. Again, if you're totally unfamiliar with sludge metal and which album do I start with first, I would say this one, Mastodon or Isis. But finally, got to give a shout out to another classic and another incredibly important band when it comes to the foundation in the early years of sludge metal, though this is not their earliest record. Neurosis, Souls at Zero. This is probably the most dynamic and versatile album of the bunch. You have quite a few songs on here that feature some extra instrumentation, acoustic passages, and stuff like that, which pair very well with the heavy riffs. This is not the heaviest record of the bunch, though. For its time, the riffs on this thing and the guitar tone was certainly heavier than the average bear. Certainly makes it qualify as a sludge metal record. I would say it's more the density and the pacing that sort of makes this record kind of feel as heavy as it does and makes it feel as exciting as it is. The vocals are pretty raw as well, which I like quite a bit, and the recording is in general. It's a pretty straightforward sludge metal album, but with some cool little instrumental additions and bells and whistles. They were certainly incredibly ambitious on this album. Certainly not as meat and potatoes as a High on Fire or as an Acid Bath and that sort of thing. And it remains to be seen, or it's definitely worth questioning as to whether or not you would even have a High on Fire, you know, without like a Neurosis, or, you know, would you even have like a Mastodon without a Neurosis? You know, that's how kind of pivotal Neurosis is to the whole sludge metal genre. These days, their newer material is much more atmospheric in tone, much more mellow, and much more sort of, you know, just like totally blissed out and very dark and very moody. Though incredibly enjoyable, though. Their last record, not their last record, they came out with a record very recently that I reviewed very positively and loved and thought was fantastic. Yeah, it was their last record. Last year's Fires Within Fires, which contained like several very epic, long, lengthy, very raw tracks that were very dynamic, had a lot of different passages to them. Easily one of their most progressive albums yet. If you wanted to try like a later era record, you know, The Eye of Every Storm is very good. Through Silver in Blood is highly celebrated as well, but I wanted to pick like a sound, a record that's much earlier in the style, since this is like a little bit of an introduction to the genre. So that is going to be it, guys. That is going to be it. That is going to be it. Those are my recommendations for the world of sludge metal. Again, starter pack, not every great sludge metal record to ever be written or anything like that, and not like a top 10 or bullshit list or whatever. This is an introduction. This is a starter pack. These are records that you need to hear, you need to try out if you're thinking, I gotta listen to some sludge metal. What the hell's up with sludge metal? How do I get into it? What are some of the most significant and important records? What are some albums that are a good baseline for an understanding of sludge metal? If I wanted to hold a conversation or basically know what the frame of reference is when someone says sludge metal, here's what I need to hear. Okay, guys? You're the best. Over here next to my head is a link to another video in the Starter Pack series. You can click on that, or you can click on the link to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one forever.